prior to...
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Welcome, everyone who's on the line. As you may have noticed from the an intro slide, you're all muted in order to make the best of the best quality audio experience for everybody and limit background noise. My name is Molly Mayo, and I'll be facilitating the call today. Thank you very much for joining us. If at any point you have problems, you'll notice that there's a contact for you, Wendy Butler at the Johnson Foundation, who you can reach either by email or by phone. And you also have the option of using a question box that should be showing up on your screen in the top right corner. You can submit questions at any point, and we will do our best to address them in real time. As you can imagine, the call is going to be fairly packed with a lot of excellent topics, and so if we don't get to your questions, we will be responding to questions after the call in written form. Additionally, if you would like, you are welcome to raise your hand at any point during the call, and we will call on people during designated periods of time. Let's see. So I think what we'll do to begin right now, it looks to me like there are several people who, or at least a couple people who are calling in by phone only. And for those of you in that situation, since you don't have a way to communicate with us through the internet, we will rely on you sending emails to Wendy to let us know if there's anything that's going wrong, or if you'd like to submit a comment or question. Okay, so let's dispense with some of the business. I'll come back on in a couple of minutes to go over some of the procedures for how we're going to be working through the agenda, and I'll go over that with you. But first, let's really start off with a proper welcome. I'm going to pass the mic, in this case, over to Roger Dower, the president of the Johnson Foundation, for a few comments before we get into some context setting. Roger, would you like to take a minute?
Thank you, Molly. I just wanted to say on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Johnson Foundation just how much we appreciate all of you joining us today for this webinar. As some of you may know, for over 50 years, the Johnson Foundation has hosted small group convenings or meetings like this one, bringing together the right people at the right time to solve challenges of the day. 3 years ago, in an effort to create more confidence that our meetings, our convenings, actually achieved real impact or change, we adopted a new business strategy where we would select 1 or 2 specific environmental issues where we would make a long-term commitment to keep creating positive change. It wouldn't be enough on these issues for us to hold one meeting. It would be a series of meetings building on each other. It wouldn't be meetings at the same place or held in the same way, for example, here at our facilities in Racine, but meetings held wherever they made and however they made the most sense. And finally, it wouldn't be just about the meeting itself. We would take responsibility for what has to happen before and, as importantly, after a meeting to really make a difference. Today's webinar is sort of squarely in this new business model and reflects our desire to experiment with how and where we convene the right people to have a positive impact on the things we care about. I'm going to let Lynn and turn things over to Lynn to talk a bit about our work on freshwater challenges in the U.S. and the origin of today's virtual discussion.
Thanks, Roger. I'm Lynn Broaddus, and I know some of you, but most of you I'll look forward to meeting in person when you're here in August. And I just want to say a word or two about how we came to this point. As many of you know, we spent 2009 and then 2010 working on trying to flesh out what were some of the real issues around freshwater, and eventually coming out with a consensus document that some of you participated in, or members from your organizations participated in, Charting New Waters, that was released in September of 2010. And as part of that, each of us made commitments to continue to work on some of the recommendations that were called for in Charting New Waters. The Johnson Foundation, one of the major commitments that we made was to follow up and using our convening capabilities on some of the issues tied to water financing and pricing and subsidies and trying to get market signals to align with long-term goals. At the same time, certainly crumbling infrastructure has been identified as a major problem. Energy and water has been identified as a major problem. Public health issues relative to the crumbling infrastructure and the emerging contaminants, and all of these tie back to our infrastructure. There are some other entities out there that are working on how to finance the fixing of our crumbling infrastructure, but this series of convenings is specifically around ensuring not only that water infrastructure is financed, but that the financing drives sustainable infrastructure. And so with that, I think I give it back to Molly to kick this off. I'm just really grateful that all of you are with us, and we look forward to this adventure together.
Great, thanks, Lynn. And just a quick station identification moment for those of you who are just joining us. This is the convening on financing sustainable water infrastructure systems. Lynn Broadus from the Johnson Foundation just was making comments. And I'll repeat a couple of times, just as we're getting a lot of people logging on the line here, that those of you who are logging on are muted in order to make sure that the audio is as high quality as possible for our presenters. And we will have designated periods of time throughout the agenda to address, to have a little bit more discussion, and we'll talk to you about the process or procedures for being able to unmute. So we've got an agenda up here. You'll see that we'll have our first group discussion points and question and answer will come after Betsy Otto and Charlene Lurig from from American Rivers and Ceres, respectively. That will allow everybody to ask some questions about the context setting and background, and I'll go through those procedures in a minute. Then at 2:20, we're going to invite Chuck Clark to give a little bit of background on how we understand sustainable water systems, followed by comments from Doug Scott about the financial benefits of those systems, sort of reflecting from the perspective of the ratings and financial sectors. Then we'll try to allow for a significant amount of time for group discussions, about 25 minutes relative to the presentations. And I know that that's going to be packed, and we're going to be balancing a lot of voices in that time, but we want to be able to get a better sense of where some of the questions are among the participants. And that exchange will help to shape where we go with the next couple of interactions. We have an additional webinar on August 10th, and then a convening in Racine at the Wingspread Conference Center. We'll wrap up and adjourn at about 3:30. Next slide, please. So overall, as we're thinking about how we want to be shaping this discussion, the idea is to establish a clear understanding of what we're trying to do with this series and what we mean by sustainable water infrastructure as we focus on this particular webinar. That's the main focus of what this call is all about. So let me just check in with David and see, is there any problem with advancing this? Oh, there we go. Okay. You just heard from Roger and Lynn, and if you'll go forward one more. I'd like to introduce Betsy Otto, who's going to be giving some additional context-setting comments. She's the Vice President for Conservation at American Rivers. Betsy, are you all set? Are you logged on okay at this point?
Having computer problems, so not logged on, but hopefully you can hear me on the audio.
Great. So if you have any problems, Betsy, just let me know verbally, and we'll do whatever we need to help you out.
Great. I think I'll be able to log in a moment, but at least I'm on the phone right now. So it's great to be with everybody, and I'm very excited about this dialogue and bringing this great group of folks together, and just wanted to say that, and to also thank the Johnson Foundation for helping to convene this group. This is an issue, sustainable water infrastructure, that American Rivers has done a lot of work on. And just to give you a little bit of background about myself and about the organization, I've been with American Rivers for 12 years. We're a national advocacy group. We're based in Washington, D.C. We've been around for coming up on 40 years. And we have offices in 12 states around the country. And we work at the federal, state, and local level on protecting rivers and freshwater systems and the policies and infrastructure investments that help to protect those river systems. So as I've said, we've been active for many years on infrastructure funding issues, both helping to increase local, state, and federal government investments in water infrastructure, but also to change the dialogue and to change the nature of how we're investing in those systems so that they will be more sustainable and more able to meet the needs of human beings and of wildlife and natural systems in the 21st century. The next slide, if you haven't gone to it already, that says Freshwater Crisis at the top. You know, I think a lot of us are familiar with the a lot of discussion in recent years about the failing nature of, crumbling nature of our national infrastructure, whether it's roads or bridges, energy infrastructure, et cetera. Water infrastructure, as many of you may know, is actually in worse shape than any other category of infrastructure according to the Society of Civil Engineers. And they don't get as much attention, water systems, as other systems. They're often not as visible, whether wastewater, drinking water, stormwater systems. We also know that climate change impacts are going to be making these problems much worse. We're already seeing big changes in precipitation patterns, and Chuck Clark may talk a little bit more about this. In many areas of the country, we're already experiencing a significant increase in the intensity of storms and floods, and also worse droughts, so much bigger swings from wet to dry, and often in the same places. So these are having really big impacts on the way we need to be thinking about how we manage water. And then, of course, we're seeing a funding squeeze at all levels of government. You know, sort of tremendous fiscal tightness, tightness in the credit markets. It's making it very difficult for government to make investments in these systems. And the last point I would make is that the U.S. is really, in many ways, falling behind both developed and emerging economies in investments in water efficiency and technology and innovation, integration, and the sustainable use of water. And that's going to be a subject that we're going to talk about more throughout this dialogue, and that Chuck is going to be pointing to as well. So again, I'm really excited to be part of this discussion. And with that, I'll turn it over to Charlene Lurig at Ceres.
Thanks, Betsy, and welcome to everyone. I'm Charlene Lurig. I'm Senior Manager of the Insurance and Water Programs here at Ceres. For those of you who are just getting to know Ceres, we're a national network of investors and public interest groups. And one of the ways that we work, next slide please, is to run the investor network on climate risk. So this is a network of over 100 institutional investors, most of whom are long-term investors. So they're managing funds for retirees, or for life insurance beneficiaries, or for other future obligations. And many of these investors are also universal owners, meaning that they're invested in every asset class in every sector. And so we work with these investors to understand how emerging risks like climate change and water scarcity might affect the performance of their portfolio over the lifetime of those obligations, and how those trends also present opportunities for those investors to achieve their investment targets while being part of the solution, so by financing the deployment of new technologies or new markets. But really, many of our asset owners want to do more than simply hedge risks within their own portfolio. They actually want to play a productive role in helping society to see what are sometimes called black swans, and by using the power of their invested assets to actually force the market into a more resilient state in anticipation of those sorts of emerging risks. And we help them to do that by engaging the companies that they own and the financial regulators and intermediaries like rating agencies who define the rules of the game. So for example, our investors petitioned the Securities and Exchange Commission to clarify what duty companies have to disclose their climate risk. And that led in 2010 the SEC to issue interpretive guidance stating that publicly traded companies do have a duty to disclose material climate risks, including effects on water quality and quantity. Next slide. But really, the publicly traded companies and corporate users of water are only one piece of the puzzle. Many of our investors have exposure to the markets that finance development of essential infrastructure like water infrastructure. And many of the corporate water users in our network are starting to realize that they are getting to the point of maxing out investments in their own water efficiency and conservation, and that now, looking forward, their water risk really lies beyond the four corners of their facilities, and in part in the public systems that supply their water. 80% of the water that's supplied in the U.S. is delivered by public water systems. And to manage that risk, we have to build systems that are resilient to 21st century challenges. And those systems will probably look and act differently than the icons that define 20th century water infrastructure. They might look less like the Hoover Dam on the left. They might look more like a citywide network of green roofs and rainwater capture systems on the right. But the scale of this challenge means that the capital markets will have to play a part in this transition, and they'll have to work alongside public dollars in a way that's harmonious if we're actually going to stay ahead of economic losses driven by water risk. So our challenge in this convening is to translate the vision of what 21st century water infrastructure looks like into language that the investment community understands, and to work with the people who are building our water systems and the people who are helping to finance them to change market norms and expectations so that capital flows to the most resilient systems we can design. So Molly, back to you.
Hear me okay?
Yep.
There we go. I think I'm unmuted now. All right, great. Thanks so much for that background. So, so this is going to be our first chance to test out our system for letting folks engage. We got some good background context setting from our first couple of speakers, and I invite anybody on the phone who would like any additional clarification about why we're doing this, what we're doing, and/or background information on the foundation or the convening to go ahead and test out raising your hand. And the way it's going to work is, as I said at the beginning, that we will be able to unmute you if you raise your hand. And so for everybody, part of this is just to make sure we've got our systems down here. To the left of your name, you should on your monitor have the option of indicating whether you'd like to raise your hand, and/or if you do ask a question, it'll send us an indicator so that we can address your question. There's also a window for questions to be submitted, and that'll go to everybody in writing. And as I said at the top of the hour, any questions that we can't get to on the call, we will attempt to address in writing, and we'll after the call, and we'll be circulating a transcript after the call for everybody, so we can share it more broadly. The other option is if you're finding any of these instructions to be difficult, or you're having problems otherwise with your audio or visual technology, then you can send a chat using the chat box to, and one of our technical advisors will address that offline. Okay, so I'm not seeing any hands coming up right now, and I'm not seeing any questions coming in. So that means that maybe we did a pretty good job of addressing some of that basic context. So I'm going to take advantage of a couple of extra minutes here just to say a few more things. Please note that because of the time that we had and the number of people who are participating, we did not do a full round of introductions. And so in addition to the background that you're getting right now, please do read the documents that Wendy sent around in advance. That includes a participant list, so you can see who else is on the call. You get a little bit more background on who the folks are that you see listed under attendees. And we will, when we do convene at Wingspread in mid-August, you will have full bios and full contact information for everybody available then. Okay, this is great. I've got one hand raised. I'm going to test this out. David Rankin, I'm going to unmute you and invite you to make a comment. David.
I thought I'd play along. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Just to make sure that we're not missing everybody.
If I can. I think the next presentation gets at it, but I will admit to being a little unclear on the scope or the edges of the convening. That is, what is inbounds and what is out of bounds here. Water is such a big thing that I am kind of still searching for some clarity about is this hard infrastructure? Is it soft infrastructure? Are we talking about watersheds? Are we talking about pipes? Please help me a little bit draw some brighter lines around what this is about.
Great. I'm going to suggest, unless you guys want to overrule me, I'm going to suggest that Betsy, if you're okay, if you're not having technical difficulties, which if you guys didn't catch on, we were having a little bit of problem offline. But Betsy, you want to take a shot at that, and then I'll invite Charlene and then Lynn to comment.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. It's a great question, Dave, and I think it's honestly, I think it's going to continue to be a question that comes up during our discussion. But having said that, I think as we have conceived of this discussion, it's to start, if you will, from, I mean, I even hate to use this term, but I will, the hard infrastructure, the existing infrastructure that we're using to bring fresh water to cities and communities, to convey wastewater and away and treat it, and start there as the sort of nucleus of what we're looking at. Now, having said that, of course, in working for a group like American Rivers, I'm very, very interested in how we start to incorporate and think about the soft infrastructure, if you will, the watershed itself, the source of that water, you know, how we can use green infrastructure systems to incorporate, you know, natural methods for managing and storing stormwater and so on. So I'm sort of I'm covering the whole waterfront, because I guess what I'm saying is that I think we want to focus on how is it that people understand water infrastructure and start there, but look for the opportunities to include the other elements of the natural infrastructure and bring them into the discussion about how can we be more innovative, how can we be smarter in how we are not only managing these systems but financing them. So I've danced around your question a little bit, but I'm doing that in part because I don't want to shut down any discussion of those broader issues, and rather, as I said, start from the notion of the hard infrastructure, the way we typically think about infrastructure as the starting point. Does that make sense? Or would others like to comment on that?
Yeah, Molly, this is Lynn. Molly said she might defer to me, so I'll just weigh in that I don't think I'd add a lot to that. I might have answered it in a shorter way, just to say that, yes, it includes both that hard and soft parts of infrastructure, and especially as we look to the future. But it's kind of up to the group to, I guess, really put the bounds on it. So, and Chuck might do some of that.
And Charlene, anything you would add?
No, I mean, I would say one of the really unique values that this convening is going to bring to this national dialogue that's emerging is the bringing together of folks who are really at the leading edge from the management of water and the management of water utilities, and the people who have been engaged for, in some cases, decades in bringing financing to those systems, rating the long-term debt of those systems, in some instances buying the long-term bonds of those systems, many for whom this notion of soft versus hard infrastructure, green versus gray infrastructure is all new. And so in part we are looking to the folks who are defining what this vision of the 21st century water utility and infrastructure looks and feels like. We're inviting them to introduce the folks from the financing community to those sorts of practices. And so I think we'll be defining the scope of what that dialogue over the course of our convening. But in part, that's the very nature of this convening, is to figure out where those boundaries extend to.
Thank you, everybody. And I'll add to that by saying that in typical facilitator fashion, I would say that over the course of these next two webinars and when we gather in Racine, that we will want to try to be as precise as possible about where we do want to put boundaries on the discussion, so that we do get a good, a quality result, so that we don't try to go too broad in a way that is not useful. So as much as we can be more and more precise about what we mean, the better. So, and since I don't see any other hands raised at this point, I'm expecting we'll come back to that question periodically. But let's move on in the meantime. And again, anybody who hasn't already done so, raise your hand or send in a question if there is more background that we might address either on this call or at a later date. So I'll move on into our next slide. Our next presenter, I should say really our first formal presenter, is Chuck Clark. And I imagine that many of you do know Chuck. You know his name or have worked with him. So you probably understand why we're so happy to have him as a participant in these meetings, and he's really been a great thought partner throughout the last year or so. I first came to know him as a participant in the Johnson Foundation's Freshwater Summit last year. He played a key role last summer and into early fall as one of the key authors and influencers of Charting New Waters, which was released in September last year. Chuck is CEO of Cascade Water Alliance, a nonprofit corporation of 5 cities and 3 water and sewer districts that provide water to almost 400,000 residents and more than 22,000 businesses. Prior to joining Cascade, he's worn a number of hats. He served as Director of Seattle Public Utilities, one of Seattle's deputy mayors, as Regional Administrator for EPA's Region 10, Director of the Washington State Department of Community Development and Ecology, and as Director of the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. He's also a board member of the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies and a founding member of the Water Utility Climate Alliance. Long list. Thank you very much for joining us, Chuck. Would you like to take over the mic?
Sure, thank you. Maybe a couple comments to start before I get into the slides, and I hope at the end the comments will be, the slides will lead you to the outcomes. Part of the challenge, I think, is exactly the question David asked, which is, well, is it soft, is it hard? And I guess my answer would be, it's all of those things. And that part of the problem that we've had when we start talking about sustainability and sustainable infrastructure is we tend to start trying to separate into categories like green infrastructure and hard infrastructure and others. And I guess what I would say is I hope what comes out of my presentation is sustainability is not about a program, it's about a way of doing business. And that if you can figure out a way to fundamentally change the way the utility operates, or that the way that decisions are made, common sense leads you to be sustainable. That it becomes not only the most rational long-term approach to dealing with multiple objectives, but it also tends to be the most cost-effective. And I would hope that the markets and others would look at those utilities and those industries that are making long-term sustainable decisions and give them, in essence, benefits for those kinds of choices. So with that, let's go to the next slide. A little bit, I'm going to give you some background on kind of what is the water industry. I'm going to talk just briefly about organizational and governance, since some folks haven't been too involved. Talk a little bit about some of the challenges facing the water industry. By no means is this all-inclusive, but at least gives you some of the challenges that all of us are facing in dealing with water and wastewater and stormwater. And then talk a little bit what I think is 21st century management, and talk about the principles of asset management, which I think in many instances will lead you to sustainable outcomes. Next slide. So we are going to talk about drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. A lot of the slides and so forth will be a little bit more drinking water oriented, but I'm going to give a couple examples that are in the slides at the end of trying to figure out how to take multiple objectives in water and wastewater and stormwater and others and have them lead you to an outcome that deals with multiple objectives and multiple problems. Next slide. So kind of what is the water sector and how it's organized? I think you heard earlier a majority of the sector is owned by municipalities, cities, counties, special districts, special purpose organizations. Hundreds of different structures are in place, and I've worked for a city and run a utility. I'm now working for 5 cities and 3 districts. There are regional governance structures, and so it can vary across the country over how people are organized to deliver services. Part of the system is delivered by the private sector, so it can be a number of ways of dealing with utilities, water utilities, but it is primarily municipal. It can be single-purpose or multi-purpose. There are a number of utilities that all they do is drinking water, or all they do is wastewater, or all they do is stormwater. In many other instances, a single utility may have all of those. When I was at Seattle, we had all of those, solid waste and others. So again, there is no single model that applies to all of them. It can also be retail, wholesale, or both. I am basically I purchase water on behalf of all 8 of my members and sell it back to them. So I'm actually a wholesaler. I don't produce the water, I don't treat the water, but I, in essence, wholesale it to all 8 of my members and the board that manages the work that I do. When I was at Seattle, we had both retail and wholesale. And so there are different models to deal with both of those kinds of methods of delivery. And there are all kinds of governance and decision making, from city councils, county councils that are elected, to appointed boards, to independent boards. There is no single model that works, although there's a generality that one of the biggest challenges is dealing with city councils and county councils and elected officials. And in many instances, as you're thinking about sustainability, a challenge it creates is that they may be more short-term oriented than long-term oriented, related to election cycles, and that can create some problems for you as you're really trying to change to making long-term 50, 75, or 100-year decisions. Next slide. There are a number of challenges facing the water industry, and I'll start with the first one. Significant numbers of the U.S. utilities really aren't operating in the 21st century. I continue to be amazed at how many people are looking at the past and not looking towards the future, are still making decisions based on the way things were done over the last 50 or 75 years, not looking at trying to be more proactive on how decisions are made in the future. An example, several years ago I attended a conference in California where we were dealing with asset management and trying to look at kind of who the world leaders were in water utility management. And I was the only, at that point, CEO that showed up from the U.S. There were 150 people at the conference, so we had a number of CEOs from Australia, South America, Europe, and other places that came to the U.S., but U.S. utilities wouldn't go to the conference to really share and find out what was going on and where the leading edge of utility management was. And you will run into this more and more across the country, that they are not looking to be proactive in changing the way that they're managing utilities. Second, water isn't really full cost priced. One of the reasons you have a lot of the infrastructure problems in the country is nobody's making the appropriate investments for replacement cycles. And you look at replacement cycles in a number of places, and they're talking in 50 or 100-year or 200-year or 300-year or 400-year replacement cycles without really looking at what the full cost is. They also aren't incorporating kind of social costs and environmental costs in pricing water and in making the right kinds of investments. And that's a problem if you're really going to try to make a self-sustaining utility that makes sustainable decisions going forward. Third, demand for services per capita use is dropping. In Seattle, per capita use has dropped since 1990, and it's dropped almost every year since 1990. So it continues to be a challenge. And the same on wastewater treatment. Lots of large plants are being built and they may not have sufficient volume to keep them operating, and so you really need to take a look at long-term trends. Benchmarking for efficiency and effectiveness is almost non-existent. I've been involved with a lot of work that's been done in Australia over benchmarking and efficiency and effectiveness. It is the only way to determine do you really have a utility that is making the best decisions it could be making. And part of the problem is, who do you compare yourself against? And if there is no good benchmarking or effectiveness measures in place, it's hard for an individual utility to figure out how well you're doing. You tend to be isolated. And lots of other places in the world do a lot of work related to efficiency and effectiveness standards and sharing information on how to be more efficient. That doesn't happen as much in the U.S. People continue to focus on short-term decisions related to supply and demand rather than long-term strategic thinking. They make decisions on the short term. They make rate decisions on the short term. I know when I went to Seattle, I was amazed that when they built their 2 last treatment plants, they contributed about 1% to 3% cash to the projects, 97% debt. The problem was, at the end of the day, what it meant is the future generations were going to pay for it to give a rate reduction to current residents, and it it was a good short-term decision, at least they thought at the time, but in the long run, not a rational decision for the organization. Infrastructure is aging. I do get a little concerned when I keep hearing the numbers thrown around by the civil engineering societies and others, primarily because it's not based on condition assessment, it's based on age. And so although I agree there are infrastructure problems and aging problems, there is not a lot of good condition assessment nor replacement strategic planning going on to deal with infrastructure problems in the country. A lot of the infrastructure that shows on the list that may, they say, be 50 years old may live to be 200 years if you really did appropriate condition assessment. That is a challenge for the industry as we go forward. And I think another part of that is that a lot of people in the industry still believe that the federal government ought to be bailing them out, and that is never going to happen. And so they haven't made that fundamental shift to the fact that they better understand their own needs, and it ought to be based on the condition of their assets, and they be making decisions based on that. Regulation continues to be prescriptive and isolated by program. It's real simple to look at stormwater issues versus CSO issues. The regulator, in most instances EPA, is treating them in an isolated way, which is going to create huge financial burdens on municipalities without significant performance improvements if people can't take a step back and make sure that they understand what the requirements are and have the requirements work together to really have a better result for the environment. And finally, decisions continue to be based on low cost, in essence looking back at history, rather than triple bottom line, which really leads you to sustainable decisions. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about an asset management approach. I'm only going to highlight a couple of these issues after I get through it, but the principles of asset management really do set up the foundation for making sustainable decisions as you go out in the future. And if you can take the principles of asset management and apply them in an organization, then you can really, I think, make a fundamental change in the way investments are made and change the direction of the organization or the city or the jurisdiction or the utility to be making long-term, fundamental, sustainable decisions that will lead you to a better outcome. Next slide, please. Asset management really, it's just trying to figure out what agreed upon customer and environmental service levels should be while trying to minimize life cycle costs. So if you start building in at the front end environmental values and social values and kind of economic values, and then look at life cycle costing, it ends up leading you to making sustainable decisions. Next slide, please. There are kind of 10 steps for doing this from a utility perspective that will lead you to sustainability. And some of these, I had some slides in here, I took some of them out, but you really ought to be spending time looking at customer environmental service levels, both quantity and quality, and trying to make a decision over what you really ought to be trying to achieve. Over time, it ought not be lowest cost return to the ratepayer. It should be highest value return to the ratepayer. And that highest value ought to be based on really looking at customer environmental service levels. In many places, they may be putting higher value on some things that if you go to low cost, doesn't get you to where they would like to see you go. Second, you really ought to be doing risk assessment and quantification, formal risk assessment. I'm amazed how many utilities don't do risk assessment, don't understand where the riskiest part of their operations are, and don't quantify the risk so that they can make the right decisions. Third, I talked about it briefly before, but life cycle cost analysis, you really ought to be doing triple bottom line. I know I looked at a number of projects when I was in Seattle, and we sent them through a life cycle cost analysis, triple bottom line screen, and I cut the capital budget in half in the first year and killed about $100 million worth of projects just based on making people answer fundamental basic questions about infrastructure. There's more and more long-range planning going on, but it still tends to be absent in many places, and it needs to be done if you're going to be making sustainable decisions. You need to understand kind of assets and data systems, If you don't do good condition assessment and you don't keep good data on the condition of your assets, how can you make replacement decisions that are actually rational? You ought to have a rational rates and affordability programs if you're going to do this. If you go to a cost of service model, you are going to have some affordability issues you're going to deal with low-income folks, and so it has to be part of a long-term strategy. And you need to deal with the organizational issues. You need to have formal capital decision-making processes, track and measure results, and do benchmarking. Next slide, please. I'm going to give you a couple examples of what we did when I was in Seattle and the same thing I'm doing here in Cascade to start trying to implement some of these principles that leads to a better decision-making process. Next slide. This is a very simplistic model that looks at age of assets, but it assumes that you start knowing the condition of your assets and can start making some fundamental decisions of repair versus replacement. And you can see kind of with the red line what average repair costs over time end up being. And so you start off new infrastructure, don't have very many repair costs. At some point, the curve starts to go up fairly radically, and it gets more and more costly to do a repair. On the green line, you see kind of average replacement costs and kind of life cycle of those costs. And the longer you can get your assets to go, the better your average replacement costs become. And what you really want to do is try to find the low point of that curve. You want to be tracking your infrastructure in a way, if you're going to make it, you should be making it, try to make as sustainable decisions as you can. But what you're really trying to do is optimize the replacement versus the repair. And find that critical point where you ought to be replacing infrastructure based on this analytic. And if you don't do that, then you're not going to be maximizing your resources and you're going to be spending money needlessly. Either you're going to be spending too much money on repair or you're going to be spending too much money on replacement. And when you see a lot of the work that's been done nationally on defining the issue, they define replacement as necessary too early rather than really understanding condition. Next slide, please. This just gives you an example of a sewer maintenance program and kind of how we constructed that curve, how we analyzed where at the time I was at Seattle we were on the curve for, we were placing things too early. We wanted to try to figure out a way to move ourselves to the right so that we were finding that right place between replacement and repair. And what it made us do is, one, understand the condition of our assets, of our infrastructure better, and two, do risk consequence models to understand the consequence of failure. So that we knew that if we took more risk related to repair, we were taking it based on understanding the consequences of that risk. And this is how that model gets applied. Next slide, please. Long-range planning. Next slide. This is why long-range planning is so important, and why when you do long-range planning on water demand forecasts, the one thing you should know is you're wrong when you do the forecast. This shows the official forecast for Seattle, which includes 80% of King County, about 1.4 million people. It shows the official forecast starting in 1967 and ending in 2006. They're doing another forecast right now. And I think it shows you that if you had made all your decisions based on the 1967 forecast, by 2000, you would have assumed that you needed to be providing 360 million gallons a day of water. When, if you look at what's actually happened, they're right around, well, now they're even down farther, but down around 125 million gallons a day in water. This is why you really need to pay attention to forecast and investment decisions and sustainability, because you could be making fundamentally the wrong decisions if you're not careful on understanding what really works related to long-term forecasting and what doesn't, and what you ought to be basing your decisions on. Seattle's next forecast will be below the yellow line, and so there's not a forecast that hasn't gone down since 1967. Next slide, please. This shows where I'm working now, Cascade. This shows the 2005. The red line shows what their forecast was before I got here. The green line shows where they said, well, let's be more conservative, and the green line is what they assume for rates, for revenue, and the blue line shows actual use. And the reason I show this slide is because before I got here in 2005, Cascade went out and invested about $100 million in contracts with 2 water utilities to meet the need that was defined here without looking at the risks on the downside, locked into those contracts, and I'm now paying for them a significant amount of money each year for water we're not using. In fact, I pay about $250,000 a month for water that won't be used until at least 2025, all based on this forecast that was done in 2004 without understanding the risks and consequences, and so the decisions were made without the flexibility of getting out of them. That's why this long-range planning becomes critical, and why it becomes so important when you look at issues related to climate change and others. Next slide, please. This shows kind of uncertainty related to forecasting. The blue lines in official Seattle forecast. All the green lines show the risk, the high end, lower end, and the red dotted lines show you the range of the forecast. Well, if you may, I think the only thing this shows is how much uncertainty there is to long-term forecasting, and how you better be setting yourself up to deal with the uncertainty of the future rather than to assume you have certainty related to the blue line. You've got to figure out a way, in essence, to do classic portfolio management and have your options covered out 20 or 30 or 40 years and a whole range of options, or you know you're not going to be making the right decisions. Next slide, please.
And Chuck, I'll give you just about a 4-minute warning.
Okay, got it.
Thanks.
I'll wrap it. I wanted to show one slide just to show kind of what's happened in Seattle, but what's started to happen nationally, which is a disconnect. This is water supply, a disconnect between population and total consumption right around 1990. Up through that period, historically, in the U.S. and other places, population growth and water use was pretty well connected. In about 1990, it disconnected. And total consumption started being not connected as much to population. And that trend has continued. And a lot of that's due to conservation and per capita water use drops. Next slide, please. Next slide. People can look at that one at their leisure. One last thing I wanted to show is, so how do you apply triple bottom line, and how do you make decisions that embed a different kind of strategy related to that? And one of it is you start trying to figure out a way to assign values to the decisions you're making. And so all I wanted to do was provide a good way for you to see kind of what we did in Seattle, what we did related to value modeling, where we actually went in and started assigning value to various components of making decisions related to a long-term portfolio for water supply, a sustainable portfolio for water supply that had both hard assets and soft assets in it. And then, if you go to the next slide, show that when you did that, what it basically did was then arrayed them based on value and cost so that you could see arrayed kind of the decisions that were made. And what some people had claimed were pretty good projects, in essence reclaimed water, wouldn't even show up anywhere on this chart. It was actually about 3 sheets of paper to the right. But it also showed that when you talk to customers and everybody else, conservation was a very high value, wasn't exceedingly high cost. You got reasonable results, but it lets you start making trade-offs and start making sustainable trade-offs over looking at things like the social impacts, the environmental impacts, and value and cost issues. So it gives you a way of arraying decisions to give you options as you look to the future. I think there are a couple other examples you can look at related to trying to figure out how to be more sustainable going forward in the future. And one is the classic CSO stormwater challenges that I mentioned earlier, and Seattle is now dealing with. They're going to be under a consent decree for probably $500 million in CSO requirements. They haven't done much on stormwater yet, but if you pull the actual results what contributes to problems in Puget Sound, the fact stormwater contributes about 100 times the pollutant loading to Puget Sound that CSO does. So they're going to spend $500 million on CSOs. They will someday be under regulatory consent decree for stormwater, but they could spend, you know, a tenth of that on stormwater and have a bigger impact than the $500 billion they're dealing with on CSOs. So as you look at making long-term sustainable decisions, you need to start looking at kind of the performance results, and the regulators are going to have to be able to start making different trade-offs, or you're not going to be able to do sustainability, and you're not going to be able to do sustainable infrastructure. It's the same way on if you start doing natural drainage in a city like Seattle, it is cost-effective to do natural drainage, you know, swales and ditches in parts of the city rather than classic curb and gutter infrastructure. And you know, people have tended to call that green infrastructure. I just tend to call it good infrastructure. So although it could be defined as sustainable, it was the most common sense option as you go forward. So that's a lot of information on this, but I hope what you just take away with is you've got to fundamentally change the way you're doing business if you really want to be sustainable. You have to fundamentally change the way you make decisions if you want to have sustainable infrastructure. And it ought not be a niche program, but it ought to be the basic decision-making framework within which a utility is making decisions, or you're not adding the highest value to your ratepayer. And that's really what this ought to be all about. Thanks.
Thanks, Chuck. And I'll say one point here that we had designed this agenda flow such that these two presenters really complement each other. But I'm just going to take a moment to check on any clarifying questions for Chuck in the interim. But we're going to have most of the discussion in about 10 minutes after Doug goes. So I'm going to check with Scott Miller here, who has his hand raised. Scott, do you have a clarifying question, or would you like to hold until the kickoff for the Q&A? You should be unmuted now, Scott.
Yes, I had to unmute myself. Yeah, we can hold it. It's not really a clarifying question. It's more of a philosophical one.
Great. That's a terrific way to kick off our Q&A. And I also have a question submitted from one of the folks just on the line and not online from John Vaughn, and we'll use that also as a way to kickstart our Q&A. But if there's no other hands raised, which I don't see, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Doug Scott. And I think that part of the reason for wanting these to go back to back is to just make sure that we're thinking about these comments that Chuck has gone into good detail on here from the perspective of a rating agency and investors overall. And so we paired Doug with Scott in order to really emphasize it and make sure that we're thinking about these issues from an appropriate range of perspectives. So I'll just by way of introduction, I'll say that Doug is the managing director in Fitch Ratings, the U.S. Public Finance Group. He serves as the manager and analytical head for both the U.S. water and sewer sector, as well as the U.S. municipal bond fund sector. And in that role, I think it's important to recognize that he has a view of the management practices and the state of infrastructure across the sector. He's thinking about it from that perspective. He's a member of their Public Finance Criterion Credit Issues Committee and a company-wide peer review committee. And prior to assuming his current duties, he served as a manager of the Southwest Regional Office, which covers tax-supported credits. He's been a speaker at numerous conferences and workshops and testified before the U.S. House of Representatives Subcommittee on Water and Power concerning water issues in the West. And before joining Fitch, he worked from 1994 to 1997 with the First Southwest Company, a municipal finance advisory firm, and subsequently the Texas Water Development Board, a state agency from 1997 to 2001. So all that background positions him well to be able to make comments on the financial implications of these sustainable water systems and take sort of the next step, build off of what Chuck was just talking about in terms of how you translate a sustainable system into financial implications looking forward long term. So Doug, would you like to take the mic? So we're not hearing you right now. If you, I don't think you should need me to unmute you, but just. Okay, so if you're hearing me, Doug, we're not hearing you, and you're welcome to use the chat box if there's any technical difficulty on your end. Okay, so my suggestion is while we work through this with Wendy's help and others, I think I'm going to go ahead, Scott, and take your question just to make the best use of time. But Doug, let us know whenever you are able to rejoin us. Scott, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just wondering how much we, to what detail do we understand what caused the disconnect between population growth and consumption? You know, in terms of the drivers and really the ethic that you know that was in play there, and likewise, how much do we know about sort of public understanding and tolerance for short-term cost savings versus longer-term investment?
Well, I think there's a couple things, and this is Chuck. There's a couple things in there. One slide I didn't go through, but it's in the packet. I went back and tried to explain what created the difference between what was the original assumption related to growth and the current assumptions related to growth, the current actual use of water from 1990 on, and tried to attribute that to what created that change. And if you go in there, you'll find 4 or 5 things. One, the system got more efficient, so and a lot of utilities are doing that. They're trying to say, let's utilize the water we currently have, so can we have, you know, fix pipes and be more efficient in water delivery. There's what I'd call passive conservation that has occurred nationally, which is all the building code changes. You know, flushing rates for toilets is a classic. But if you look at things that have changed related to plumbing codes and so forth, that has driven some of that per capita reduction. People started getting fairly aggressive in the 90s over conservation. You know, washer rebates, we do that, toilet rebates, irrigation rebates, but that more active portion of conservation that you typically see around the country. If you're in Vegas, you'd be looking at turf buyback programs, for example. But active ways to try and modify use patterns. And then I think pricing. You see you can look at the elasticity numbers on pricing, and I think all of those have led to changes and that disconnect from what was the fundamental relationship on the elasticity between population growth and water use. So that was the first part.
Just to follow up on that, so what I take away from that is that it's more utility-driven, and that what you would infer from that is that the public interface with that is the desire to save money or get money, if in the case of buyback.
Well, it's also this, you know, when you ask the public, you know, percentages of how many of them are environmentalists, it's usually about 80%. We'll say 70 or 80%, they'll say they're environmentalists. When you ask them to how they're, you know, whether they want to pay a price to be environmentalists, most of them would rather have industry pay a price to be environmentalists. But there are some things they do like. They do like conservation. So they're willing to, even if it kind of gets to your second point, are they willing to pay a little bit more and not have that short-term gain? And, you know, conservation was one of those things they said, you know, we would like to pay more. So there was some, I think, some buy-in by the ratepayer to want to do some things that they perceived as green. I think in the long run, with the cost of developing new supply, it's probably been it's very productive in many areas to have a strong conservation program, but not everywhere. So you know, it's hard to really judge exactly what all has led to that. But you know, it's kind of the brown lawn theory in many places too. I mean, people seem to be just much more comfortable now with letting their lawns be brown, or at least out here, than they used to be. So I can't figure out, you know, what led to all of that, what was the driver, but it just seems that all of that together has led to fundamental change.
Let me interject here. Doug, do we have you back? It sounds like we might.
Can you hear me now?
Great. Terrific. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I apologize for that. Go ahead.
Nope. I'm going to let you go with it when we have a couple more questions to kick things off when you're finished.
Okay. Well, I apologize for that technical delay. I will try to keep my comments brief. Essentially, after listening to Chuck, the rating agencies, I think, share a similar viewpoint as Chuck does as far as some of the challenges that are out there. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the rating agencies, we essentially have the role of helping investors understand the potential risks of being repaid and getting their investments back. So when we talk about sustainability, it's very much in line with what we are trying to communicate to investors when we actually assign credit ratings. And when we're looking at it, we're looking at essentially 4 fundamental factors that, asset management, the rate making, all of this really feeds up into 4 basic areas, and that has to deal with the governance and management of your system, the financial profile of the system, the debt profile of the system, and then the operating profile of the system. And operations is really a fairly broad area that encompasses everything from water supply and sustainability to whether or not the pipes are actually functioning. But essentially for us, it really comes down to when we're talking about these long-term issues and how it's going to be solved economically, that it really comes down to us that there has to be a necessity and ability to produce and sell the product that these utilities are looking at providing, and then on the flip side of it, the ability to generate adequate revenues to pay not only the cost of production and supply and everything, but also the debt service with it. And so if we really kind of consider those 2 aspects, what have we done over the last several decades is we have built a tremendous amount of infrastructure. We've met a lot of regulatory standards, and all at the same time, the systems have been able to post very strong financial results. And you can really see that on slide 33 with just the debt service coverage that we've experienced over the last several years, the amount of cash that systems have been able to build up. And I know that there are concerns within our sector, but there's also concerns within other sectors as well that they're really not performing quite as well as water and sewer are. But essentially, one of the other things that we've managed to do probably too well is hold costs down, so much so that it's now difficult for people to really kind of envision that this service that has really led to a higher quality of life here in the U.S. and has really allowed the U.S. economy to flourish, that it is essentially free. And so in looking out into the future, one of the things that we're very concerned with in the short term is really changing the perception of users of these systems. We've been very effective at engineering systems, and I have no doubt that when we talk about the long-term issues with water supply and the regulations and crumbling infrastructure, that we can address those from an engineering perspective. But at least from the short-term perspective, we are concerned as a rating agency about the perception of how much the cost of these services should be. And so when we look at slide 34, just in terms of the capital cost and funding, what we have noticed over the last couple of years is that many of the capital costs now have been shaved back. A lot of that has been due to expansion projects being cut with the recession. But essentially, these capital costs are still not enough to really make sure that the systems are working properly or operating efficiently. And from the long-term perspective, just in terms of debt, it seems to be more of this idea of reliance more on debt instead of addressing and building up system financials and balance sheets to manage some of the cost constraints that are going to be happening over the next couple of years. If you go to slide 35, what all of this has meant, at least over the last year, is that many of the systems, while we entered the recession very strong, it was largely due to just chance, because the cost of service had been kept so low that we just had a lot of people using the service, and we also benefited a lot from construction that filled coffers with connection fees, and those are not likely to come back. And if our cost of service really can't or our rates can't capture our full cost of service, it will potentially be a long-term credit issue. Certainly over this year, we as raters do not necessarily like to see rapid change one way or the other. We're trying to take a long-term perspective, but when with everything that's happened with the recession and some of the short-term decisions that have been made, it has really weakened a lot of the financial profiles that we have been seeing, and so the numbers that we saw in 33, those numbers are not going to be as high when we publish our next round of medians. In effect, if you look at the 2011 numbers in terms of upgrades and downgrades, the rapid escalation in terms of financial deterioration that has driven these downgrades is really a concern. And I guess the one thing that I would leave just as kind of my main point in going back to changing people's attitudes is that you know, the cable industry has been very successful in convincing people that they needed cable television, and the cell phone industry has been the same way. But we probably are going to have to do a better job in the next couple of years as we address some of these long-term issues and convincing people that their quality of life and the economy of the U.S. is really predicated on having a solid backbone of infrastructure and supply to meet our ongoing health. So I will wrap up my comments there and save the rest of the time for the Q&A session.
Great, thanks, Doug, and thanks for bearing with us with the technical difficulties. So we have a couple of questions already queued up here that I'll go to next, and for those of you who are still pondering some of this good information, let me sort of stir the pot a little bit by saying very clearly that for this particular piece of the series, what we want to do is to make sure that we really understand these water systems and what we mean by sustainable, and that we all have a basic foundation for the financial implications long term. And the reason for that is to make sure that we can come into the more deliberative phase of the process at Wingspread with a common understanding. So for those of you who are catching up on one piece of this or the other, or wanting to make sure that we all do interpret this information consistently, or that there isn't misinformation or what have you, I think this is a good time to tee that up, and it'll also give us some insight into how we want to carry the discussion going forward. So, for example, on the call today, we don't expect to, as a full group, to dig deeply into the alternatives, what are alternatives for using this information, et cetera. We will be getting into some of those pieces on the next webinar and at Wingspread, but we want to be able to tee up some of the questions. So if they're out there, please let's get them out on the table so we can start thinking about how we want to organize the discussion going forward. So again, as a reminder, just you can use your hand-raising tool, or feel free to type in a question, submit a question using that window on your desktop. So I'll start with the question that was submitted. Oh, there's a new one from John Bond. So I'm going to read I'm just going to read them in order since this one's new to me. But actually, you know what? I'm going to ask Wendy or Lindsay just to mix up the voices a little bit. John Bond is listening over the phone, so I don't think that we have the ability to unmute him. And just I want to make sure, David, if that's not the case. But if not, then let's ask Wendy to read off the question if you're comfortable with that.
Yes, I'm fine. John is asking, finding out what to do is fairly easy. Doing it is very different because there's no agreement on the value priorities. For example, what is sustainable between agriculture users and people who are concerned about adequate water for fish are very different. How might we engineer agreement?
Great. So that's a big question. I'm not sure that that's actually directed necessarily at Chuck or Doug. In my mind, that is an excellent question to be thinking about how we want to be framing some discussions going forward. But I will invite Chuck, Doug, Betsy, Charlene, anyone else who would like to make a comment from the panelist perspective to feel free to weigh in with a short response, and we can always frame that for a future, more detailed discussion.
This is Chuck. Maybe I'll take a quick stab at some of it. agricultural issues are extremely difficult. If you look at the elasticity of price on the ag industry and their margin of return, they tend to walk a pretty fine line. So there are some real inherent trade-offs in keeping that industry sustainable while you're trying to look at efficiencies and other things. But as water got short, particularly in Australia, they've made a number of trade-offs have occurred between municipal water users, business water users, and the ag industry, where business and municipal users started, in essence, purchasing efficiencies for the ag users and going in and fixing their systems, their irrigation systems, getting a significant increase in efficiency in the system, and then sharing that back with the ag industry. So the ag industry, in that case, didn't have to make any of the investment, but got a significant portion of additional water that they wouldn't have gotten, while the municipal and business also got a portion of water that worked out in a cost-effective way for them. So there are some things that can be done. I mean, if you're in an urban system like Seattle, you're not dealing that much with the ag industry, and then it's really dealing with your ratepayers and your customers, trying to really kind of get to your point of determining what their values are, and at least trying to figure out some way of approximating what you think are their interests and appropriate values. And all you can do is do the best job you can using focus groups and workshops and everything else. But at the end of the day, are you really representing their values or not? It's a hard question to answer.
So I think, as we get into this more deeply, trying to understand it from those different vantage points is going to be important, which also relates to, I think, because these two are indirectly related, I'm going to raise his first question, which was understanding the concept of, I believe this is what he meant, that he's asking about understanding the concept of sustainable water systems from the perspective of water short areas versus water surplus areas. And any comments from you in particular, Chuck, since that was direct?
Oh, sure. I mean, yes. I think your situation drives sustainability in much different ways. I mean, it's if I'm sitting in Seattle and really looking out at and thinking that I have water through I don't know 2100, 2200 without making significant supply investments. It drives one set of values and one set of what would be defined as sustainable infrastructure investments. If I'm Pat Mulroy and sitting in Las Vegas for the South Nevada agency and trying to look at how am I going to come up with water, it may drive significantly different analytics that would lead them to reclaimed water, to giving money to California to build desal plants while they take more water out of the Colorado. I mean, it fundamentally can change those equations, and I think that's why it needs to be specific to the area you're in. The principles are the same, but the outcomes can be radically different.
Great. So I'm going to ask Peter Malik to share a comment that I think is directly related to this, and then we'll go on to the next question after that. So Peter, I've just unmuted you, so if you'll go ahead and share your observation with the rest of the group, that would be great. It sounds like you might be on speakerphone, so if that's the case, if you can take us off speaker and use your headset, that would be best. Okay, we're not hearing Peter. All right, so we'll try to communicate with you, Peter, to work out some technical difficulties. And I'm going to go on to David Rankin and ask David to share his next question. I will just say, for Peter's sake, that he is making an observation about a need to look more holistically, given the constituencies, a myriad of institutions, et cetera, and the various perspectives. I think that's dead on with what we feel is important, and we want to make sure we do get that comment from Peter. So we'll come back. So David, I'm still hearing some feedback, so I'm wondering if that might be Peter. Sorry, David, just a second. Okay, so David, you should be unmuted now if you want to go ahead and share your question and comment.
Sure, thank you. I have actually two questions. If I can start with a clarifying question for Doug. Can you tell us about the universe of Fitch-rated municipal water and wastewater issuers? Or give us a sense of how many is in that population, and whether we're looking at general obligation bonds or revenue bonds, or just tell us a bit about what's behind this data.
The information itself is based strictly on revenue bonds, and the Fitch rated universe of those revenue bonds is around 400 credits. So you know, a relatively small sample of the entire universe that's out there. The other credits that we do rate, depending upon some of them that may have a tax-backed pledge, they're not picked up within these numbers that I showed you. This is just strictly those that have pledged their water and sewer revenues.
Thanks. That's really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I'm just checking to see if we can get Peter on yet, but it looks like not quite yet. So I'm going to go ahead and take Harriet. You did have a comment a moment ago, but then you put your hand back down again. I just want to double check. Would you like to share a comment or question?
Yes, my question was actually fairly basic. I wondered if Doug could actually just go back over those slides and just explain what the various headings were. There was the one on 33 and 34. I don't think you actually said what the information is.
Well, that's a good point. I take it for granted that people like myself that are working with this all the time that are used to seeing this. But the debt service coverage is essentially for, at least on slide 33, the debt service coverage and cash flow medians. Utilities who issue revenue bonds who have pledged like their senior lien debt or have various liens, you might think of it in terms of a mortgage on a house and a car loan and a credit card debt, that the mortgage on the house is secured, the car loan is secured by the car, but the credit card debt is unsecured. It's somewhat of a similar concept here in who gets paid first and what's being secured. So those people who are senior lien debt holders, they actually are generating or have the benefit of having more cushion. So like in 2011, let's say, their cushion level between how much the debt service was versus how much revenues were available for debt service on their bonds was a little over 2.2 times, so very good cushion level. Those bond investors who were at a subordinate lien level only had about 1.9 times coverage. And what we're seeing now for this year, we don't have medians published yet, but we're seeing that cushion for all bondholders has really come down a lot and is going to be much less than what it has been in the past. The dashed line there, the free cash, as a percent of depreciation, we're essentially looking at how much money is left over at the end of the day after a utility pays its operating expenses, they pay their debt service, and they make their transfer to the general fund of a city that they might be owned by, and then comparing that to what their actual depreciation expenses are for the year. And so you can see that at least for 2011, as utilities went on, they had been generating pretty healthy revenues at the end of the day that were, could be going into their savings account or could be invested back into their infrastructure. But by 2011, utilities on balance were not generating enough to create a sustainable infrastructure if you're just looking at replacement costs. So that was a concern. Going over to the next one, the liquidity and debt service cost, what we're trying to measure there with those bars is how much cash does a utility have essentially within its savings account or checking account relative to its daily expenditures. And so utilities have quite a bit of cash relative to those daily operating expenses. This doesn't take into consideration their debt service costs, but just operations. And they've been able to basically maintain their rates at less than 1.5% of median household income. So that would essentially equate, if we were looking at the U.S. Total bill, would equate to around $55 per household. I'm sorry, it's about $85 per household for combined water and wastewater service relative to the U.S. median. And then just the debt levels, we on 34, the debt medians are dealing with how much debt does a utility have relative to each customer, both now and into the future, over the next 5 years, what those debt levels are expected to be, and then what the percentage of the increase in the debt is going to be over that 5-year period. And then the capital cost and funding, that is dealing with just how much utilities are expecting to spend relative to each customer. And bear in mind that on a national basis that the customer count, there's generally 3.3 people per customer. So if we were to extrapolate that to a population basis, this would be roughly $100 per customer in 2011 that utilities were planning on spending. I'm sorry, per capita that utilities were planning on spending.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks, Doug. So I'm going to, unless anybody else wants to interject here, David, I still have you unmuted. I'm going to just mention here that your question, you have a second question, I believe, that hasn't been answered yet, related to the universe of municipal and wastewater issuers, et cetera. Am I correct in that we haven't addressed that, right?
No, Doug spoke to that, and it was very, very, very useful to hear that this data set is 400 revenue bonds. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Thanks for bearing with me there as I was trying to work through some of Peter's technical difficulties there for a minute and got distracted. So we'll go on to Steve Modemeyer. I'm going to go ahead and, for those of you following, you can see that he has a comment here, and I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. I wonder a little bit about your ability to see, because you're showing up as grayed on our, so it looks like maybe I can't. Is that right? I cannot unmute Steve, is that right? David, can you clarify that for me, since he's grayed out? Steve Modemeyer.
It looks as though he needs to enter his PIN number. Steve, if you can hear us, if you're on. There should be an audio pin in your audio section of the webinar box.
So Steve, if you have that capacity to do quick, you can enter a PIN number that will allow your audio to be enabled so that you could speak directly to the comment that you made. In the meantime, if anybody else has any comments, I can take another one here while we're trying to get Steve connected through audio. I sort of hate to read it for him because it's a really good observation, but I might just go ahead and do that just if we just because of time concerns. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do that since I'm still not hearing from Steve. So I'll just read his comments aloud. There are a number of alternative approaches for water that can also be included in the quote-unquote portfolio of options that Doug showed on his risk plus cost chart. For example, one of the costs that makes centralized water reuse expensive is the need to build a whole new distribution system. This cost can be avoided by doing wastewater treatment and reuse on-site, and this can be done cost effectively at flows of less than 100,000 gallons per day, at flows of less than 100,000 gallons per day. This has the added benefit of adding capacity as it is needed instead of big, bulky, centralized plants that take 10 years to design and build and decades longer to pay for. However, most centralized utilities do not have confidence or interest in operating distributed systems. There are private operators and private capital that can make this happen profitably, but the use is rare so far. So we keep building these large, inflexible systems based on projections of demand that are routinely overstating the need and potentially the revenue that they will generate from rates. Great observation. Anything you want to add to that, Chuck?
You mean since Steve used to work for me? No, I think he's right. There are a number of challenges we didn't get into here, but I was in Seattle. We didn't do our own wastewater treatment, but we had big arguments with the regional wastewater treatment facility going back to revenue, and they'd issued a lot of debt to build those large systems. And as we started working with, with companies to look at their own self-sufficient treatment systems within new buildings in Seattle, it created a real interesting policy dilemma for the regional treatment agency, because they were looking at, they liked the idea of a sustainable system, but they worried about the loss of revenue that they had anticipated and built into their system when they built the larger facility. So I think Steve's exactly right, but it is a challenge, and it's a challenge also with conservation right now. As you saw the numbers on demand going down, if you keep doing conservation and you keep shoving demand down and you already have more supply than you need, at what point does that trade-off become a challenge? And I think Steve's point's a good one. It's where you get this conflict between kind of long-term benefit versus short-term rate impact, and how do you deal with the consequence? I think that got asked earlier by somebody, kind of, you know, how tolerant are your ratepayers of paying more in the short run to have these long-term benefits? And I think it's a classic challenge of sustainable infrastructure.
Thanks, Chuck. And again, flagging that is another area I think ripe for further discussion at a later date. So I'm going to invite Wendy then to share with us. We have Peter Malik does have another question since he's having problems with audio. We'll ask Wendy to read that, and then I'll take one more comment, and I think we'll start wrapping up since we're getting to the end of the hour. Go ahead, Wendy.
Great. What role do people see in biomimicry, i.e. riparian zone, restoration, water funds, etc.?
Anyone want to comment on this at this point, or is that another one that we want to flag that we need more time to dig into?
Maybe one quick comment is Chuck again. It's fundamental for some systems. I mean, if you look at, you can look at Seattle's system related to riparian protection in their watershed that prevents a lot of sediment loading to the reservoir, which means they don't have to do filtration. So what is a riparian protection on one part of the watershed saves the city $150 million in their treatment train. I mean, there are fundamental relationships that are important, and so that's the short-term benefit. If you look at the long-term benefit of protecting riparian areas, if you test Seattle's water supply, and you know, if you test in parts per trillion, there are no endocrine disruptors and no pharmaceuticals, zero. Well, why is that? It's because you're protecting the watershed in the riparian area. Many other systems in the long run, 20 or 30 years from now, are going to have to treat for that. Seattle won't. So there are some fundamental linkages that you need to take a look at looking at kind of how all those pieces fit together. And I do think it needs to be on the list as a component of a discussion when you look at kind of sustainable infrastructure.
Thanks, Chuck. And I'm going to move to Martha real quickly here. We're running out of time, but Martha, since your comment really speaks to things that we can focus on in the future, I'm going to unmute you very briefly here and ask you to, if this works here, ask you to take the comment as a placeholder for further discussion in the future. And if you're on speakerphone right now, if you use the handset, that'd be great.
I just, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello? Okay.
Yep.
I just had two questions. One just relates to how much I agree with the presentation, in particular the discussion by Seattle about these foundational changes in the way that water is being used and how important it is to understand those trends and where they're headed in order to appropriately plan for investments in water supply sustainability or reliability. And the issue I come across is that I can see those trends, but convincing decision makers that that's the real trend. We've, for such a long time, have correlated population growth with more water demand, and we don't have a really robust set of data and published articles that are talking about how profoundly this change is occurring. So one of the questions I have for the future is this process in a position to help develop some of that information and pull it together in a package that can be used by water agencies with their decision makers? Is there stuff that's already out there that really hasn't been well circulated? But I see that gaining the understanding about these trends as being really, really important to being able to then deal with appropriate planning on water supply investments.
Great.
And then just really quickly, if I can, the other one is just We haven't talked about rate structures and how they are set up and to what extent they're covering fixed costs versus variable costs. And that's a whole other story.
Yep, agreed that we need to be thinking about that and digging into that more carefully, unpacking that. So I'm going to also unmute David LaFrance, and hopefully as just also a segue into making a note about our next webinar. David, if you have a comment, just know that we probably won't have time to respond to it in any detail since we're already at the end of the call, but we would love to entertain that, get it on the table, and we'll make sure that we do our best to respond to it another time.
Yeah, no, I just had an error in pushing the buttons.
Oh, okay, so terrific. So just raised your hand but didn't mean to. So I'm going to unraise your hand and use this. I'm sorry that we are going over here, but it's maybe timely that you did that because David is going to be one of our featured presenters on the next webinar. So I'm going to segue now into just a few quick notes on key dates. The next webinar is on August 10th at the same time, 2 o'clock Eastern. And I just mentioned that segue because David is going to be addressing some of the ground-setting information on private financing of water infrastructure in the U.S. and abroad and what we can learn and what we need to understand about that as we're thinking about alternatives and how we can incent behavior. And Brian Thomas from Public Financial Management is going to be talking about the municipal side of the financing, sort of giving us some basic foundational information about how that works from both the private and municipal perspective on the next call. So we're all kind of up to speed on the basics, and that'll help to set us up for a good conversation when we're all together. So that's going to be the main focus of the next one, unpacking those financial options and understanding those better. If you have any questions that you would like to make sure that we do address on that call, please send them in advance. And if you have any follow-up questions that we didn't get to on this call, we'd ask you to go ahead and send those to us, and we'll try to weave them into how we capture the results from this call. You will have a transcript. We can go on to the next slide and just let folks know that there will be a transcript that's going to be circulated, including the written questions that we saw. And I'd also put in a plug for, let us know how this went. If you had any problems or if anything worked particularly well with this call, let us know because you may have noticed that we are working through a couple of the details or the glitches, as it were, in a couple of cases. So we'd like that feedback as we get this nailed down more smoothly and make sure it continues to operate well. So I'm going to turn to Lynn quickly to make any parting comments, and I won't have time to summarize key points, but I will make any other additional details as needed.
Yeah, this is Lynn, and I have no parting comments other than I can tell that this is going to be, I feel like we just kind of got a little whiff of the good stuff that's going to be happening. I'm very excited about where things are going. And
muted.
is anybody still there?
Hear you again.
Yeah. Did anybody hear what I said?
No. I heard you just before. You were just saying I don't have a whole lot to add, and then you broke off. So
okay. So I think that what I need to do. No, it wasn't a muted thing. It was it cut off, my guess is I don't know if it automatically cut off at the end of the. Because it was pretty much right at 2:30 at like 1 minute after our time.
It looks to me like we still have any attendees that are still on, though. So if you do want to pick up where you left off, we can probably wrap it up. I'm assuming that everyone who's on the list can still hear us.
Yes, sir. Whoever's there. This is Lynn. What I was just trying to say is, obviously, well, we just reiterated that we've had some technical difficulties. This is our first time doing this, and we appreciate your patience with that. But I'm really excited about the conversation that we're going to have, again, on the 10th, but most especially on the 16th through the 18th. And I thank you very much for the efforts you put in today and all the homework you're doing and bringing your good thoughts with us. See you in a while.
Great. And I'll just start by saying you'll be getting some more information from Wendy Butler. You've noticed that she's really a primary conduit for information. If you haven't already registered for the Wingspread meeting, you did receive a note on that. Please do so, and please do respond to her emails for additional information as needed so we can get set up for that. And you'll receive the same kind of webinar information prior to the August 10th webinar. So thanks so much, and thanks for being our guinea pigs on this style of convening for this kind of an event. We're seeing it as a good use of pushing some information out to folks, and are really looking forward to a more deliberative, more engaged kind of discussion when we're all face-to-face together. Thanks very much.